So today we will discuss the worst case scenario. What happens if the Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, captures all of Idlib? How will the dynamics and the balance of power in Syria change afterwards? So first of all, obviously, full entire control by the Assad regime over Idlib would mean a disastrous humanitarian catastrophe. So the United Nations is expecting up to 2 million Syrian refugees going to Turkey. And such an important influx of Syrian refugees from Idlib towards Turkey is something unbearable for the Turkish government, as Turkey is already hosting the biggest refugee population in the world with 3.6 Syrian refugees alone. So there are also Iraqi refugees, Afghani refugees, and other refugees from other parts of the world. So Turkey, as the biggest host of refugees in the world, would not bear this cost, and therefore Turkey would face a big catastrophe in which the Turkish government will be faced with a big pressure from the Turkish opposition, as the Turkish opposition is more than ready to use the card of Syrian refugees again to weaken the Turkish government. And the social tensions in Turkey are not like 2011, 2012, where the Turkish people have welcomed the Syrians. At the very moment, hate speech against the Syrians have increased sadly, and this hate speech, in line with a new refugee flow, a massive refugee flow, will ultimately lead to a huge social escalation inside Turkey between the Syrian and the Turkish local population, because especially in the border region of Turkey and Syria, we have a demographic change already happened there. For instance, there are cities like Kilis who have more Syrian population than Turkish population. So this demographic change will have big effects on the Turkish society if there's a new refugee flow. So therefore, such a catastrophe will ultimately lead to the decision of the Turkish government to allow all of these refugees go towards Europe, and not only allow them, but maybe even to help them how to pass into the European Union. And the European Union would most likely face with a big internal crisis. We remember the refugee crisis in the European Union before, and this time it will be even bigger. So Putin gets two birds with one stone. He destabilizes Turkey, and he will also destabilize the European Union if this refugee flow happens. And the only thing which stands in between is now the Turkish army in Idlib. However, we go with this worst case scenario. What happens if the Assad regime captures all of Idlib? So I have used red dots to symbolize the presence of Iranian militias and Iranian-backed armed groups, or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Idlib, or in Syria, excuse me. And I have used yellow dots to symbolize the Russians. And I have used blue dots for the Americans. If the Russians and Iranians capture all of Idlib, this would mean that the major escalation in Idlib would end. At the very moment, we have a massive amount of Iranian-backed militias at the region of southwest Aleppo. When Idlib is done, the Iranian militias will become free to go elsewhere. And these areas where they will most likely go will be the region of Deir ez-Zor. So it's been expected that after a victory in Idlib, that the Iranian militias will focus on the oil regions of Syria. So at the very moment, the American soldiers are preventing the Iranians from crossing into east side of the Euphrates and capturing the oil region, so they are denying it. And here the American president has made a decision to keep the oil. But after Idlib, more Iranian militias will be able to relocate to the Deir ez-Zor region in order to capture the oil, and this will change the dynamics of Syria massively, because we know that there are three main roads from Iraq to Syria and from Tehran to Damascus. At the very moment, one road is being closed by the YPG. The other route has been closed by the American presence here at Tanef. And the other route here at Abu Kamal al-Qaim is being used by the Iranian militias to supply Damascus and elsewhere and to reach the Mediterranean. With the new victory, with the possible victory in Idlib, Iranian militias will also try to open the second route, the fastest route from Tehran to Damascus at El Tanef, by attacking this region where the American soldiers are currently denying it to the Iranians. However, this will not be the last change of power of balance in Syria. It's been expected that after the victory in Idlib, the Russians will be strengthened even further. So they will likely try to capture Afrin. The Russians will also try to capture the Euphrates areas, and so pushing out the Turkish armed force and the Turkish presence inside Syria out of the country. And by doing that, the focus of the Russians and the Iranians will more and more come to the American presence. At the very moment, we have here at the region of Tel Tamil an escalation between the Russians and the Americans. So the Americans are denying the road from Tel Tamil to Kamishli to the Russians, and therefore the Russians need to go via land route at the border towards Kamishli. However, if Idlib is being lost, the Russians will be in a much stronger position, and the Americans will not have any more Turkish presence inside Syria, inside Idlib foremost, to balance the Russians, and therefore they will have a much stronger position against American presence in northeast Syria as well. So therefore it can also be expected that the Russians will use the new momentum and the new balance of power in their favor to push out the Americans out of Syria back to Iraq. And in this line, if we count all together, this would mean the capture of Idlib is nothing just about the M4 and M5 highway. It's nothing only about economics and fighting against terrorism, as the Russians claim. It is a strategy. So if the Russians and the Iranians would be able to capture Idlib, they would be able to achieve a military solution inside Syria, because with the new balance of power, the Russians and Iranians can enforce a military solution. What does that mean? The Assad regime, who have killed hundreds of thousands of Syrian civilians, will be the winner and victorious in the conflict in Syria. And all of the recent years, of the 10 years of conflict, and even more in the coming future, will become meaningless from the Assad regime perspective, and they will become victorious. So the prospects for any political solution will be demonized entirely, and we will have a new Syria. This new Syria will be different than before, because in the pre-war era, the Sunni Arabs were the vast majority of the Syrian population. However, at the very moment, the big portion of Sunni Arabs in Syria have left the country. The Sunni Turkmens have left the country, and a big portion of Sunni Kurds have left the country as well. And if we have a military solution in Idlib and in Afrin, Euphrates, and in northeast Syria, in the region of Deir ez-Zor, this would mean that even more Sunni Arabs would leave the country of Syria, and Assad would govern over a controllable size of population in which the Sunni Arabs are no longer the majority of the country. And this will have more long-term implications. So we would have another population like the Palestinians in the world living as refugees who may not return to their homes in the near future. And the Assad regime could easily have new elections as the majority of the Syrian population would no longer live in Syria. So therefore, viewing the case of Idlib as just something which matters for the Turks, or as something about the M4, M5 highway, or as something as fighting against terrorism, as there's a Hayat Tahrir Sham presence, is wrong. Idlib is more about Idlib. Idlib is the key to a military solution in Syria. And if the Assad regime, backed by Iran and Russia, succeeds in Idlib, I do not expect that there will be any hope for a political solution inside Syria anymore.